Thank you all so much for coming. And as I was kind of invited late to this panel in the past 2 weeks, and the topic I think is really important. So I jumped at the opportunity to put some slides together. And when I was thinking instantly this title came to mind when I was thinking of the hype, because for a long time, as someone who has taken a interdisciplinary and critical in the sense of considering multiple different ways of looking at things perspective on psychedelic medicine, I run into a lot of people who have a belief that psychedelics are so essential to get across the finish line medicinally within the context of Western medicine that we have to all be on the same team, stay in line, don't speak up about issues, lest we ruin this potentially cosmically important movement from crossing the finish line just as we're nearly there. And a lot of people have said specifically, in order to kind of atone for or correct for the long time stigmas and misperceptions associated with psychedelics, we should lean into the hype to balance it out. But I think the hype is actually incredibly dangerous for a number of reasons and ultimately unnecessary to advance the field of psychedelic studies. And so the reason I mentioned you can be both pro-psychedelics and anti-hype, I'll just begin with some context about myself so you can understand where I'm coming from. I've had a number of debilitating psychological issues over the course of my life that psychedelics have fundamentally transformed. So I grew up with, as I was saying before, debilitating obsessive compulsive disorder and social anxiety. Later realized that that was associated with neurodivergence. But when I was growing up, all that I knew was that I felt incredibly overwhelmingly anxious. And I would feel a compulsion to go back and repeat what I was doing before I had an anxious thought, because I was too anxious to even look at what I was afraid of. And so I have notebooks from when I was younger where I would write a sentence over and over again, the same sentence 5 times. You could see the letters thick with multiple lines of the pen moving over each letter. And it was because I just felt like I had to go back to what I was doing before I had the anxious thought, as if it could reset and get back before that had happened. And I was really driven by this compulsion when I was younger. And then everything fundamentally transformed for me when I was introduced to LSD in my freshman year of college. And the fact that I'm now able to go and give talks around the world in front of sometimes, up to hundreds of people speaks to the transformations I have personally experienced due to psychedelics. So that's the context. Like, I know psychedelics can be amazingly beneficial, and yet I have concerns about the way that psychedelic medicalization is getting rolled out. So the context of hype and this bursting of the hype bubble was in the discourse for sure before this article came out, but it was really emphasized by this piece out of Johns Hopkins with David Yaden as the lead author. They address a lot of points in this short viewpoint, but a key takeaway is that the hype is bad for both science and for patient participants. That this overemphasis on psychedelics is some kind of magic bullet that's going to cure all kinds of, kind of prevent trauma from happening in the future, cure every kind of mental indication in the absence of broader societal reforms is not a realistic way of looking at the available evidence. So just shortly after that hype piece came out, there was this PBS Nova special on can psychedelics cure? And that question, cure, I'm glad they have the question mark there, but it really emphasizes this one and done approach to thinking about psychedelics and their impact on healing. So I'm just going to include some of the quotes from participants that are included in this PBS special. I haven't felt sadness since taking psychedelics. It's like reprogramming the operating system of a computer. You're getting down to very basic code level changes. It worked almost like an antibiotic, where I did this treatment and then I was done. I was having headaches and muscle pains, but it was the best headache I'd ever had in my life because it told me that the psilocybin was working. It was actually physically restructuring my brain. And it's very possible that some of this is an accurate reflection of the ways that some people experience psychedelics, but there's also a slippage. And as I'm a literary scholar, and so I'm really interested in thinking about metaphor. And there's a lot of metaphors in how we talk about psychedelics that through a game of telephone kind of take on a life of their own. And people assume now, oh, it resets your brain. It's like a computer. But these are ultimately, there might be some truth to it, but we can also be limited in our ways of thinking about how psychedelics work by the reliance on specific kinds of metaphors and reifying those metaphors. And just that first point here, I mean, I haven't felt sadness since taking psychedelics. It's not realistic as humans to expect that we're never going to experience any kind of negative affect or discomfort. That shouldn't necessarily be an aspiration. So we should really, when we're seeing these circulating narratives, I think it's important to emphasize, these ways of describing psychedelics are potentially very impactful at a time when vulnerable populations, people who are desperate for healing, are willing to seek out whatever possibilities they have to cure their situations. And it's important to note that biomedicine is backed by science, and science requires more than anecdotes. So, and again, I'm saying this as someone who has experienced firsthand profound healing from psychedelics. But if we're going to be bringing psychedelics into specifically the Western medical framework, we need to be careful about the kinds of ways that we're doing science, how we're communicating the data, trying to do more and more rigorous research that's isolating and specifying what are the components that are actually leading to these outcomes beyond just the administration of the psychedelic itself. What are the non-pharmacological variables, the setting factors? We need to be looking at all of this and really thinking deeply about the implications. And as Yaden and his colleagues at Hopkins pointed out, part of the issue is media coverage, because as the methodologist Eiko Fried has pointed out, and I find this quote really useful, because as you're reading through it, you can kind of feel your eyes glazing over by the time you get to the bottom of the quote. It's much sexier to write a newspaper article about revolutionary new psychedelic treatments that make people with paralysis walk and people who are blind see, compared to writing a newspaper article about the fact that a study switched outcomes and had issues of multiple testing and external validity and blinding, leading to several validity threats and raising questions whether these drugs actually work. The complexes of how science can be methodologically flawed or not super rigorous, to get into the weeds of that is not easy to do well in a headline. And so you were seeing media running with the anecdotes, and then there's an underemphasis on the fact that a lot of the science is extremely preliminary. And in terms of the confidence that we can have in the outcomes that we're seeing are quite low due to a number of factors that I'll get into shortly. And this reflects there's a broader issue in psychology and medicine related to an issue of replication, where a lot of ideas that have been taken for granted as a valid way of thinking about psychology, for example, have had issues with actually replicating. And people have been realizing there's a lot of different factors of why that is. Some of it is just this publish or perish mentality. There's this drive to publish findings that are very persuasive that might not necessarily be the most rigorous science. And there's been, in those broader fields outside of psychedelics, a lot of people have explored ways of doing science differently to increase the chances that we can have high confidence in outcomes. One of those solutions has been pre-registration. And again, my background's in literature, so I've only been getting into this recently as I've been doing my research. But the gist behind pre-registration is that if you have a data set and you haven't said in advance how you're going to measure it, how you're going to analyze it, you can take out all kinds of surveys or draw all kinds of lines through the data and keep doing that until you find a line that fits the data. And then you can say, look, this data set has this outcome, which I can show because of this very persuasive line that I've drawn through the middle. The issue is that the more times you roll the dice with how you're slicing and measuring the data, the more chance there is that just by chance, you rolled a number that corresponded to the data set that you have. So the idea behind pre-registration is that you have a hypothesis. You say, based on this hypothesis, I expect this to happen. This is how I'm going to analyze the data. And then if you succeed in shooting the ball and it gets into this faraway net and it goes in, then there's a higher chance that that was a reflection of the accuracy of your prediction. Whereas if you don't show in advance what you're expecting to do, you can just keep drawing cards out of the deck until you find one that looks persuasive. And while there have been some steps towards pre-registration in the psychedelic science field, there's also issues with how researchers have gone on from pre-registration to interpret those studies for the public. And so in my Dark Side of the Shroom paper that I did somewhat recently, I was really intrigued by two descriptions of the same SSRI or escitalopram versus psilocybin study by two people who were involved in the trial that almost sound like they're describing completely different studies. So one example is Robin Carhart-Harris writing in The Guardian, where he kind of gives the impression that it was a clear outcome that psilocybin was more effective than escitalopram. So he mentions those in the escitalopram group did about as well as one would expect based on previous SSRI trial data. In comparison, psilocybin worked more rapidly. At the end of the trial, the average response rate to psilocybin therapy was more than 70%. Now, skipping to the bottom, he does a rhetorical technique, which I described in the paper as assuming the sale. So if a car dealer wants to sell you a car and wants to kind of pressure you into wanting to buy the car, they don't say, do you want to buy a car? They say, do you want the one with the brown seats or the yellow seats? Because then it makes it kind of more awkward to say, oh, I don't really want a car. It's like presenting the preferred outcome in the question. And so that's kind of going on here, where it's why does psilocybin appear to be a more successful treatment for depression than a typical antidepressant? And he goes on to describe a different mechanism of action other than chemical imbalance that could explain why psychedelics are more beneficial than SSRIs. But again, it's assuming that outcome to have been the case, which is why it was so interesting for me when I came upon Roz Watts' description of that same study, where she said, after 2 years leading this trial, you might think that I'd be disappointed that psilocybin didn't outperform SSRIs. Many people point out the limits of SSRIs, and yet psilocybin has all this hype and expectation around it. Yet this result is something to celebrate, because I think it goes to show the power of care. And so she really emphasizes here that the whole therapeutic package and caring community around this study was, from her perspective, contributing to the positive benefits that people were seeing with SSRIs. So the implication here is maybe SSRIs have become less effective in part because they've been abstracted from these contexts of caring communities. And if we approach psychedelic medicine as the same way, as this pill that you take and you're addressing this brain-based disorder, then we might see the same drop in efficacy as we are claiming there's a difference. And it's as a result of these complexities and issues with the strength of the methodologies of the science that the American Psychiatric Association last year put out a statement, in part because people are so excited and kind of bought into the hype. The public is so intrigued by this potential for psychedelics to be a cure. They mentioned that there is currently an inadequate scientific evidence base to support claims about psychedelics as a mental health treatment for any indication. And so I want to emphasize again, there is potential, but there needs to be more research to understand, is this a safe and effective treatment for which indications in the context of how Western medicine approaches healing? So it's in this context that I wanted to talk about a statement open letter that me and my colleagues at Symposia recently put out in response to John Oliver's psychedelic assisted therapy episode that just came out on February 19th and last week tonight. And when John Oliver's show last week tonight reached out to us for the first time, I was extremely excited because I was a huge fan of the show, and I was really impressed by the ways that they were able to cover topics in a more nuanced perspective than a lot of the mainstream media coverage. So I was thinking this could be a great opportunity to get some of the complexities and nuance and the risks of potential harm across while also talking about potential benefits. But even though I and my team had spoke for several hours with a producer for Last Week Tonight over a series of months, by the time that episode aired, it was completely had ignored all of the concerns about the strength of the science and really emphasized this issue of like access and how can we get this out quickly, assuming it's a done deal, that we know that this is a safe and effective medication for various psychological indications. So as a result, we put out this open letter on Symposia. I'm going to kind of quickly talk through some of our concerns there, because a lot of people who had watched that show, who are on the more kind of nuanced critical side of psychedelic studies, were saying how disappointed they were that it was such a kind of superficial narrative. And they were like, well, maybe they just didn't know about these issues and the risks, and they just, it was an oversight. So we put this letter out because we wanted to mention we know they knew about these issues because we told them. And we're hoping to hold the media to a higher standard in addressing some of the complexities and not running with hype-based narratives. So the reason, as I was mentioning, I was optimistic was that the show has a history of highlighting the self-serving tactics of unaccountable corporations, which is an issue with psychedelics, the failures of regulatory agencies to act in the public interest, and the complicity of the mainstream media in advancing narratives that serve the powerful. All of these factors are fueling hype in the psychedelic field. And all of this is really important to consider, given that the psychedelics industry has global ambitions. And there are people who work in the industry side of things that if you say, hold on, let's try to go more slowly, do more science, think critically about the way that we're rolling this out. I've seen people say, you must want global climate change to destroy the planet. You must want us to not be able to survive as a species because we need psychedelics to cure depression and anxiety, to fix climate change, to fix political polarization, and to address the rise of fascism. So if you don't want us to be pushing ahead with this field, you must want all of these things to get worse. The problem is that all of these things are actually fueled by inequality. And so if we don't address those underlying structural factors, then we're ultimately dealing with a sleight of hand situation where the corporations are saying, their CEOs are thinking, this is my chance to be a billionaire. This is my chance to helm a unicorn corporation. So they're increasing inequality while they're claiming to have the solution for the effects of inequality. And like I said, I'm all for more science. The issue is that the science so far has been extremely limited. There are small sample sizes and methodological issues that cast doubt on the 80% cured numbers that we're seeing, as I spoke about yesterday. Many of the most prominent clinical trials don't control for variability. Sometimes there's doses mixed together. Sometimes there's really different therapeutic interactions happening outside of the context of the administration of the drug itself. And all of these variables are getting lost in the sauce of just publishing these data, these outcomes. And those are really important factors. So we need to be looking at all of the factors and standardizing, not to standardize for the public in the sense of if you do psychedelic therapy or take psychedelics, it has to be in this very strict, regimented way. But when you're trying to do good science and reduce the amount of variables that you're looking at, that allows you to focus in on specific variables and see what could be confounding factors. There's also the same questionable research practices like drawing lines over and over until you find something that looks persuasive, or p-hacking and these other issues that have contributed to the replication crisis. We know that those have been issues in other fields, but they're happening in psychedelics. And we need to be holding our science to a high standard and not just doing the easiest thing that will make it look like it's a done deal. So one of the issues that I have with the field is that there's a lot of true believers who are in the research world who see the project of psychedelic science as a political project. We already know that this works. We just need to do the right song and dance to get this across the finish line. And it's justifying a lot of people cutting corners that really shouldn't be cut. And then lastly, there's not a lot of long-term follow-up in terms of like how are, you might have had an 80% cure rate shortly after the trial, but we should be looking further and further into the future of how much do these outcomes actually stick for people. There's also been some issues with the specific way that people are measuring the outcomes. Like you might get better based on this one scale for PTSD or this one scale for depression, but your overall quality of life is worse afterwards. So we need to be looking at things like quality of life. Like, do you feel like things are better? Because there have been studies where people might have gone in looking at psilocybin for depression, but their anxiety got way worse after. So we need to be thinking more holistically about the ways that people are benefiting from these studies. And another thing I'll just mention quickly is that a lot of dominant assumptions about psychedelic therapy are not scientific and are based in essentially magical religious beliefs. And it's totally fine for people to have their psychedelic magic and psychedelic religions, but you shouldn't be calling it psychedelic science. You shouldn't be trying to like bring in ideas that don't have any scientific evidence base and then normalize that as the best way to do therapy when it hasn't been evaluated. And right now, there's no consensus on what constitutes the clinical practice of psychedelic therapy. So again, if you're interested in woo ideas and kind of alternative medicine approaches, that's totally fine. But we need to be, if we're talking about evidence, we need to actually test these things within a scientific context. And then my colleagues who were involved in the Power Trip podcast had a line that was really controversial in the field. They said, this isn't just a matter of a few bad apples. The entire orchard is rotten. And I've talked to a lot of psychedelic researchers who have been really offended by that idea because they're like, I know that I'm a good person. I'm here for the right reasons. The people I work with really care about positive outcomes. And you're acting like all of us are bad people. That's a misunderstanding of this point. The point is that there are some closely held ideas in the field that are shared by large numbers of people, like bad trips are the best trips, that encourage and promote certain kinds of exploitation, whether financial, sexual, emotional, otherwise. So it's not that everyone is bad or everyone's here for the wrong reasons, but there are some underlying ideological assumptions about the nature of psychedelic healing that have contributed to harms both in clinical trials and in the underground. And given that there are already risks now before things have scaled globally, there's a lot of indication that if we just continue on the way that we're doing things, there's going to be more problems. There's going to be more people hurt. And so it's really important while things are still at an early stage to consider and think thoughtfully about what it is that we're doing, what we're scaling, what we're normalizing, and think about if we have any blind spots about other ways we could be doing things that are more supportive and helpful for people. We need to not push this as well onto, people who are, as I was saying before, desperate for healing, and really emphasize that the science is very in early days, and we need to do more research. And ultimately, our point in all of this is to say, when the media runs with the hype, it's only fueling these problematic dynamics. And so we're at this stage where, and I was speaking to a researcher when I first got here, they paraphrased it as, the hype is cringe now within the field. Like, we've gotten past that initial excitement bubble. And I think it's important to be able to say, you can be pro-psychedelic and insist that there's more nuance here than some of these media narratives are suggesting. And so I'm just going to end with pushing back against two common attempts to address the hype that I think have their own possibilities for unintentional harm. One of them is you have to do the work. So it's not a silver bullet. You see this a lot where people feel like it's not going to fix everything. You still have to do the work. I've seen that come up at this very conference. And there is some truth to that, for sure. And I don't want to diminish that at all. But we're seeing people who are coming to psychedelic therapy trials or underground, and it's not working for them. And then when you tell people you have to do the work, people are feeling culpable, responsible for blowing the one opportunity that they had to finally be free of their PTSD or depression. So I don't think we should be putting the responsibility solely on people doing the work for themselves and saying, if it didn't work for you, you just didn't do the work. So I just really wanted to encourage people to think in a more nuanced way about that line. The last one is this: you need a guide. A lot of the harms that I'm seeing in the field are interpersonal harms. They're not harms caused by the drug in isolation. And I came across, this was a post on Facebook by a psychedelic guide who, my jaw dropped when I read this quotation. So it says, if one uses psilocybin mushrooms, they really need to do so in a respectful manner. Whenever people tell me that they just want to take a large dose and go camping and hiking, I cringe or I lose my shit. As for psychedelic support clients, I specifically advise against that. From a harm reduction perspective, this is very unwise. I think it is not a respectful use of the medicine, and it's fundamentally irresponsible. Consult with a professional, read the literature, and don't fuck around. When I read this, I was just like, all of my experiences that I've had incredible healing, they were all just with my friends. I was never in a situation with therapy. So to say that you need a guide, that the guide's going to protect you from harms in these contexts is preposterous. Hiking and camping with psychedelics can be amazing, for sure. And to claim that that's irresponsible is irresponsible. Thank you. It's also goofy as hell. Like, I cannot take that seriously at all. And so to normalize that as like, I am the wise professional guide and I'm telling you, you can't trust yourself or your friends. You have to trust a stranger who is putting out a shingle at a time when there's still a lot to be learned as the leader, the guru. It's like, that is more dangerous. We don't have enough clinical trials right now for everyone to go into. So people are going to the underground. They're finding these figures that are self-identifying as the guide that you need. And there's I would argue, a higher likelihood for harm sending people to strangers that have some sense of magic psychedelic powers versus people camping in the woods with people they know and love and have community with. And that psychedelics can actually be a community building opportunity for people in a mutual aid, grassroots support system framework that doesn't require on these hierarchies of knowledge that the medical model is currently promoting. So I just want to end by saying decriminalize mutual aid, decriminalize community support, keep psychedelics for the people. So thank you.